Last time I took us on a tour of domestic area AH at Ur, as it looks today. But what did it look like 4,000 years ago? I'm Brad Hafford, archaeologist at the University of Pennsylvania and field director at the ancient city of Ur. It would be great to actually walk the streets of the ancient city, but we can't do that without a time machine. Even a realistic model is pretty hard to make because there's so many variables and so much disagreement among experts that we can't finalize it. So today I'll talk about where and why scholars disagree and then show what I think it would have been like using photos from Woolley's excavations, later photos and reconstructions from the site, a basic 3D model of the foundations, and some artists' drawings. In late 1930 and early 1931, Leonard Woolley dug a large area of domestic space covering more than 7,000 square meters. Working with almost 300 diggers, he revealed about 50 individual structures accessed by narrow streets and alleyways. His map of the area forms the basis of our understanding of old Babylonian neighborhoods still today. There were later houses here, but they were in such bad shape that Woolley only dug down to the best preserved walls and floors. And that is what this map represents, a period we call the Isin Larsa to Old Babylonian. In absolute terms, these houses likely date from 1900 to 1740 BCE. Ancient structures like these are never complete. Typically, only the foundations remain. Luckily, at Ur, they used a lot of baked brick, which preserves well. There was also a period of depopulation at Ur, starting around 1740 BCE when Samsu-iluna, son of the illustrious Hammurabi, sent troops to put down a rebellion at Ur and other southern cities. This meant that the houses lay mostly abandoned for some 200 to 300 years. The roofs collapsed and soil washed in, preserving the walls 2 meters or more in height. Later people moved in, and sometimes they dug pits to take bricks for their own buildings, but much of the old Babylonian area was preserved. So, you would think that we could make a good model of the area of AH. But how tall were the buildings originally, and what were the roofs like? Well, we're pretty sure about the roofs because we often find their collapsed remains. They were made of narrow beams, reed mats, mud, and bitumen. They were flat, and they could only cover small spans because wood was scarce. Large beams were only present if imported from a long distance away, so they were only used in important public buildings. Ancient Mesopotamia had date palms, poplars, and some minor fruit trees, as well as tamarisk brush and a lot of reeds. Poplar can make short beams, but palm is spongy and not good for construction. Reeds can be tied together to make bundles to make structural elements, and reed huts were common, but they didn't last as long as brick. Most brick was formed in molds and left to dry in the sun, but it could be made even more durable by firing it in a kiln. Baked brick like this was typically used at the base of a wall, but at Ur they used a lot more than at most sites. The upper portions of the wall were continued in mud brick, but how high? This leads to one of the biggest debates among Mesopotamian archaeologists. Did these houses have multiple stories? Well, Woolley believed that most houses in AH had 2 floors. In domestic area EM, excavated in 1926 to 27, he located what he believed was a good model for the typical Mesopotamian courtyard house, and he reconstructed it on paper with 2 floors. His reasoning began with the fact that most of these ancient houses had stairs in them, but we know that roof space was used for many purposes, such as crafting, winnowing grain, and even sleeping in hot weather. So the stairs possibly could have led to the roof. Walls at Ur are typically between 60 and 80 centimeters thick, and this might have been enough to support an upper floor, though not with independent wall alignments on that floor. Since the courtyard is the primary access to most rooms on the ground floor, room access on an upper floor would be more problematic. Woolley felt he had solved this problem when he noted a brick in his typical house, lying 90 centimeters away from one corner of the courtyard. He surmised it was a bracing block for a beam that held a narrow walkway around the courtyard, allowing people to walk to any room at that level without disturbing other rooms. Well, there's a lot of problems with this reconstruction, the most obvious being the general lack of wood for building this type of walkway. Another is the apparent leap of logic from a stray brick in a courtyard to an entire walkway above. Plus, the first floor was almost certainly very tall. In hotter climates, buildings are often built with high ceilings to allow hot air to rise up and create circulation. This makes adding a second floor even more problematic. The taller the building, the more pressure is pushed onto the lower wall. And what about windows? In almost every case, we find no evidence of them, even in walls preserved more than 2 meters in height. Some scholars say that, therefore, the lower floor would be too stuffy to be used for anything but brief activities, and that the second floor would have windows and be used for other things, especially like sleeping. But windows probably did exist on the ground floor. They were small and high up near the roof itself. No matter where they were located, they had to be small, since they require a lintel to deflect the pressure of the wall above. Wood or stone for strong lintels was not available, so the typical lintel was a baked brick, limiting the size of the opening. And we do have some windows like this preserved, so we know they existed. You don't want a big window in southern Mesopotamia anyway, at least not before glass panes. A big window would allow a lot of dirt to just blow into your house constantly. Well, the defining characteristic of the Mesopotamian house was the courtyard, a large unroofed space in the center. It allowed light and air to flow throughout the house. Yes, some rooms would get stuffy and have low light, but most were perfectly livable. And the courtyard, street, and roof provided ample space to work, cook, eat, and play. Of course, not every building would be the same height or have the same number of windows, and some may have had partial or even complete second floors. But I think that most buildings were single-storied with high ceilings, up to 4 meters or more in height. I also think that many, perhaps even most, would have had lighter structures like reed lean-tos on the roof to provide shade while working there. Some of my colleagues, including very good friends, disagree with me, and Woolley would certainly have disagreed. In one case, number 11 Paternoster Row, also called the Con, he proposed 3 stories. It was the largest house in Area AH and now is covered by the reconstructed House of Abraham, so-called. In Woolley's reconstruction, the 3rd floor is really just a minor brick structure as a stair outlet, and it has a lean-to of reeds. This is pretty much what I envision for the minor roof structures that may have been found on most single-story houses. 5 or 6 years ago, I worked with an artist, John Pearson of Sharpe Design in the UK, to create an illustrated walkthrough of Ur for the Middle East galleries at the Penn Museum. It was a great experience because it made me think about the evidence in a new way, a way that brought all the evidence together in a visual form. John asked me many questions about what the buildings, windows, doors, furniture, and people were really like, and I gathered as much reference evidence as I could to help him draw it. Some doors and furniture were made of wood, but others were made of reeds. We have evidence in text, but also sometimes in clay models. Unfortunately, we don't have elaborate painted walls like those in Egypt showing scenes of daily life. We do have clay figures and plaques, but many of those show gods and kings rather than typical people. Well, after many months of work, we eventually created a walkthrough of the city. I'm showing here some of the drawings in progress and some that ended up not used in the displays. I found every stage of the process intriguing and helpful, and I think that John did such a great job that I wanted to show his work here in addition to what is currently shown in the museum. It's the closest I can come to what the domestic area might really have looked like. We animated the artwork in a subtle way, and we used a style that was intentionally not photorealistic to show that this is an interpretation of the evidence. I find computer renderings can be a little too convincing. People see them and they think that there's no question about the realism, that we know this is what it was like. But I want people to know that we are always learning, that every representation is evidence-based opinion. That's what research and science are all about, always refining our models with the best evidence we have. I hope you've enjoyed this evidence-based tour and that you'll join me again next time on Artifactually Speaking.